Hi, I'm Doug Black at Inside HPC, and I'm here to moderate an SC20 retrospective panel discussion. We're looking back at highlights of last week's virtual supercomputing conference. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, AMD's Instinct GPU Group, which notes that they just launched their first 10 teraflops plus GPU. Okay, so let me introduce our panelists. We have Bob Sorensen. He is Senior Vice President of Research at HPC industry analyst firm Hyperion Research. We have Addison Snell. He is CEO of analyst firm Intersect 360 Research. We have Elad Raz. He is CEO of stealth startup Next Silicon, which is developing a new approach to HPC architecture. And we will be having Dr. Thomas Sterling. He is professor of electrical engineering at Indiana University and an HPC industry luminary. Thomas is experiencing internet difficulties this morning, so we will be recording his comments separately. Okay, so let's start with Bob. Bob, tell us what were your one or two key takeaways coming out of SC20 last week?
There were a number of takeaways that I got from that. First off, I feel like the conference is taking a breath, pause before the plunge, if you will. We're kind of pre-exascale in the sense that we're all waiting for the new systems to come out. AI has been around for an awful long time as far as the field goes. It's been a number of years, and what we're seeing, I think, in my mind, is incremental improvement in terms of what we're seeing in AI. So there wasn't a lot of earth-shattering developments there. I think we're all kind of waiting a little bit for quantum to hit, to make its play in terms of the advanced computing sector as well. So in my mind, the conference tends to go in peaks and troughs. I don't want to say this was a trough, but I think at this particular point in time, it was business as usual, perhaps more than anything else, and perhaps as much as we could have business as usable this year.
Okay, a bit of a lull, maybe we'll call it. Addison, I'll turn it over to you. What was your biggest takeaway last week?
I understand what Bob is saying there. I do think there was some important movement, not only with some particular product announcements, but in the evolution of how we talked about things like AI in this space. I did notice a subtle shift in that conversation versus where it's been at previous shows. And we talked about it as this new workload. We talked about it then in terms of where does it overlap with HPC? Where is it part of HPC? How do we get to AI augmented HPC? I think that is still part of the dialogue. But this year, we really heard as part of the conversation the notion of machine learning workloads as being distinct from other types of HPC workloads. And I think some of the product messaging and strategies started to emphasize that bifurcation between traditional scientific computing workload, which is still 64-bit, and the increasingly lower precision AI and machine learning types of workloads. So I did see an evolution there. I think we've seen an evolution of cloud and as a service and how it relates to high performance computing. And we've seen an evolution of how we talk about data movement, data tiering. So I think there was movement forward in all of these conversations. Bob is right that there wasn't like some our new achievement, but I think there were definitely conversations that were worth paying attention to.
Okay, over to you, Elad. What was your key insight coming out of the conference last week from an overall perspective?
First of all, Doug, thank you for having me. And as a vendor, I tend to focus on future technologies, and I do want to change the direction of the talk from what Bob and Eddystone were talking about AI and machine learning, and start with the surprising event that happened, that suddenly the top 500 and green 500 list are suddenly convergent, which is a good sign that we are in a good path forward. I guess that now it's clear that hardware utilization and throughput are more important than sheer performance. And the trend of the birds of feathers and the invite talk and the paper was clear. the high performance computing needs to find the next big thing. Naturally, every speaker tries to steer the conversation and the talk toward its own different technical point of view, if you might say, about the HPC market, ranging for a unique CGRA solution that runs stencil algorithm to accelerate weather simulation, to nomomorphic encryption, and obviously what Bob and Eddystone were referring to with tons and tons of machine learning, innovation, and more. But when I listened to those ideas, a trend started to emerge. A lot of the speakers talked about a new type of software, or even raising a bold claim, software must be rewritten. Moreover, a lot of paper and innovation were focused about, hey, we have this new brand of AI accelerator with a lot of peak performance, but with a low accuracy and mixed precision. Let's try to modify existing application to utilize or change a small part of the algorithm so that it will use this low precision, low accuracy, but get much faster results. Having innovation coming from other directions. Instead of, this is what we have approach, potentially novel architecture and innovation, we look to reinvent hardware and preserve the software, and subsequently thousands of engineering years.
Okay, thank you a lot. Bob, back to looking over the agenda and the sessions that you went to, were there any that you thought particularly stood out as being particularly valuable?
Well, certainly in my mind, I really liked the keynote address this year, because what it did was, if you didn't see it, go see it. It really talked about how climate research has been going on for almost a century. Some of the existing technologies and math and physics that have gone on have been going on for an awful long time, and how HPC has added to the conversation and how it can add to that conversation in the future. So to me, presenting an interesting and compelling use case that's really on the forefront of the issues that we need to be dealing with today, and putting HPC in the context as an enabling technology, I thought gave some really interesting perspective. The other thing that I thought was fascinating about this, and if you look at it, I think I wrote the numbers down here somewhere, only about 289 people actually viewed that keynote live. And over 9,000 have seen it since. And to me, that's an interesting aspect of what SD can do here in this virtual environment. It's not presenting a live event as much as putting into the record some interesting and compelling arguments and discussions and insights. And I think that's something that I think is important going forward, is that some of this stuff needs to be documented and preserved in such a way that we can allow 9,000 people to view an important topic after the fact.
That's an impressive number, no doubt about it. Addison, how about you? Were there sessions you were particularly impressed with?
Yeah, absolutely. And to start with, I'm glad Bob mentioned Bjorn Stevens' keynote talk from Max Planck Institute. I was fascinated by that, so I'll just upvote that one. I thought the other plenary talk later in the day, the More Than HPC plenary, was interesting. Elke Altintas in particular gave a chart that really showed the disparate data sources and potential goals of using high-performance computing to combat COVID-19, and I think that was very topical in that plenary. A little further down the list, first of all, I was very pleased with how many people attended the panel I moderated on the diverse approaches to tiering HPC storage, which I think just shows how practical a topic that is right now for people who are incorporating flash and NVMe and SSDs into their environment, but aren't going to the full cost of having an all flash environment. But this notion of tiering is really on point for a wide range of HPC users. I mentioned in the interview I did with you prior to the show that I was looking forward to HPC in the age of uncertainty. That was very cloud heavy, but really showed how the utility computing model can help people address uncertainty in planning for high performance computing workloads. And they had Ed Sue on from Rescale, Nita Chappelle from Microsoft Azure, and others. I thought that was really excellent content. And then I'm sorry that we haven't been talking to Thomas Sterling live as part of this interview, because I was really thrilled with the time capsule predictions that on exotic technologies, where they had the projections that experts made at SC06 and then rolled them forward to where are we in 2020, and then take furthermore do predictions out to 2035 for both computation and storage. I thought those time capsule presentations were really exciting. And as analysts, we have before taken out, here are slides that we showed 10 years ago. We're going into our 15th year now as analysts, so I'll be able to show some 15-year-old slides and talk about where were we as analysts and where do we think it's going looking forward. I'm a big fan of those types of presentations to say not only where do we think it's going, but where did we used to think things were going and how close were we in terms of predictions. So in your follow-up conversations with Thomas Sterling, I hope he'll be able to comment on some of those, because he was involved in those panels.
Well, as a matter of fact, I chatted with Thomas over the weekend, and I happen to know he is going to be talking at that panel, and I think he's got some interesting comments. So, Elad, over to you. Panel sessions that you thought were particularly outstanding.
Absolutely, and I fully agree with Bob and Eddystone with their keynotes. And while participating in previous SC, the previous supercomputing conference were focused on storage and networking, while this year the main recurrent theme were around heterogeneous computing and AI and machine learning, and I want to expand on that a bit. So the two keynotes that I like is obviously Beyond Stevens, climate change, and what I like about this keynote the most is the fact that he reminds us how much effort the computer science community is putting to accelerate this workload and how much impact they have over the world. So thank you about it. Another keynote that I like was the third wall and the need for innovation in architecture. And I think that this is the lecture that Eddystone referred to as the time capsule, where we could see past innovation and how they reflect on future innovation. And that was brilliant. The recurrent theme around the SC was about climate changes, forest fires, and obviously drug simulation, especially in the age of COVID-19. And those took the center stage. And there were key discussion around the paper talks and the different both, hashtag HPC. I participated in the LLVM workshop and also the 5th Deep Learning and Supercomputing workshop, where Greg Stevens gave the keynote. And it was interesting because he mentioned that they could take an existing classical HPC application and using AI modeling and speed up those applications from a different range, from 1,000 times faster to 4 million or 1 million times faster, which was a refreshing surprise, which linked into the this year Gordon Bell Award winner, pushing the limit of molecular dynamics with machine learning, where that was a unique first-of-a-kind integration of physical properties of matter and machine learning model. And it was a well-deserved win. During the lectures, I tried to categorize the different papers. This year, there was around 100 papers submitted. I haven't watched all of them, to be honest, but I just did a small catalog. I tried to catalog them. So quarter of them were dealt about AI and machine learning. Another quarter was about heterogeneous computing. Just think about this number, 50 papers, on almost half of the paper presented were dealing about a future technology which might be a good candidate for exascale for the future of exascale machines. Only a few discussed about quantum, and this is referring back to what Bob had mentioned. And I think that it's a strong indicator that quantum isn't mature technology yet. One paper in particular stood out. A paper about the Astra supercomputing called Challenges and Lessons from the First Petascale ARM Supercomputing. They went into great details about how they build a supercomputer, what were the pain points about building a computer with unproven technologies. Kudos to them, very interesting paper, go and watch it. Additionally, the invite talk chaired by William York were fantastic, mostly focused on future technology, and they were very insightful. Having said that, I'm hoping that future conferences will dive into more novel approaches to solving critical issues the compute industry is struggling with.
Okay, Elad, thank you all. Thank you. Good stuff. Bob, back to you. How did you think, do you have some thoughts on how SC20 went as a virtual event? And do you have any suggested improvements or thoughts about the next virtual conference, if this one, again, in the same format next year?
Okay. Well, I live right outside of Washington, D.C., so we tend to be very political here. And watching the debates, I'm going to take a page from their book and not answer that question at all, but go with something that I'd like to talk about perhaps on another theme. There's 2 points I'd like to raise here just rather quickly. The first one is, I'm glad that we've gotten this deep into discussion and we've only hinted at the top 500 list. But the one thing I would like to highlight is the fact that for yet another round of top 500 list, we haven't seen any evidence of what's going on in terms of Chinese development at the highest end of computational capability. There have always been some rumors about machines in China that were being built or even deployed. And in some sense, I was looking to see something happen this year and this list in terms of what was going on in China. And we didn't. And I think it's interesting that perhaps the conference going forward should start to think about some of the larger issues that are affecting supercomputing or advanced computing writ large. What's going on globally right now in terms of indigenous capability, a certain amount of political overtones in terms of what's going on. I do like to note that of the top 10 systems in China right now, all 10 of them are on the US government entities list as being locations that are of concern to US national security. It seems that HPC is becoming perhaps much more politicized than it has been in many years, perhaps since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think we need to start addressing the fact that HPC right now may become more of a political football than it has been in the recent past, and that may ultimately affect the trajectory of research and development and commercialization and some of the competitive issues going forward. So that's the first one. The second one is basically a reflection on a simple observation. When we were at the 32 nanometer node in semiconductor development, there were about 20 companies making semiconductors. When we got down to about 16 nanometers, there were 11 companies. When we went to 10 to 7, there were 5. For the 5 to 3 nanometer node, we're looking at a maximum of 3 companies being involved in actually making advanced semiconductors. For an organization or an industry that is so dependent on semiconductor progress to field system development and innovation, it seems that we are reaching a point of narrowing of options here. And I really think that going forward, we need to start thinking about how we can really try to energize what's going on at the semiconductor production base to ensure that there's many sources of supply, that we're all not just looking at whatever innovations come out of the big 3 manufacturers, TSMC, Samsung, and Intel. There's some interesting work going on there, but I don't view this as a very good trend, and I would like to see the SC community really start to think about where they're going to get their feedstock from a technology perspective. It's almost as if this was like an agricultural conference and no one's worried about the fact that there may not be a lot of water available in the next few years. So again, I'd like to see SC start to grapple with some of the larger trends that are affecting the industry, not directly, but ultimately can have some pretty interesting impacts on the trajectory of the technology in general.
Okay, so an agenda suggestion. Yeah, very good. Eddystone, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It was certainly interesting trying to have a virtual conference this year. And as much as Bob was saying he's not going to answer this question, I think he highlighted something that was related, which is that this is a community event. I think we're used to thinking of supercomputing as a borderless global scientific community. And what Bob is really talking about is the extent to which economic or political relationships between the current administrations have degraded that somewhat. And I think that is a concern when you look at the apex of the Chinese supercomputing community being secretive right now about what's being achieved at those levels. I think the United States has been in that position before. So that's something that's a geopolitical concern. But beyond that, I think a great thing about supercomputing as a conference is that we can all get together and immerse ourselves in it. When I'm there, I'm sort of always there, even if I'm washing my hands in the men's room or getting a coffee. There's always the chance of bumping into somebody and having a conversation that I hadn't been counting on having, and that's a part of the community. And what I found was that was certainly more challenging in a virtual event. I think they did the best they could in terms of certainly the content that was available is top drawer, and I'm still consuming content from this event. Having it all recorded and on demand, as Bob was alluding to before, it's all there. And if I make that choice to commit to it, I can still go back and continue to view a lot of those presentations. I was doing it still over the weekend. But what I found was that my engagement with the conference did take more intention, as it has with everything that's virtual. I'm in my home office here. I have to make the choice to be engaging on my screen rather than looking away or getting distracted by something else. And that is a greater challenge for all of us to bring that level of intentionality to coordinate with a virtual event. And I think it's a lot to ask of people who are giving of their time. If I could rewind it and do it again, something I should have anticipated but didn't was I should have anticipated that it would have been beneficial for me to just operate on East Coast time, on Atlanta time the entire week, and I didn't. I'm based in California. It would have been better for me to just get up at 4 in the morning and be online starting at 5 in the morning, 8 Eastern, and be there through the whole conference every day. I was certainly up earlier, but I wasn't operating the same way as I would have if I'd been there in person, and I regret that I didn't. I think I would have been better off engaging in that way as if I were there, pretend I'm part of the virtual event. Another thing I'll give them kudos for was the student outreach. All of the virtual panels had their different student volunteers. I think they did a great job to the extent they could, incorporating students into the virtual events. The national labs had outstanding student participation. And if you were a student who was looking to get involved in the high performance computing community, I think there were a lot of opportunities for that in this virtual event. On the flip side of that, we lost the ability to actually integrate with the community in Atlanta. I think being there would have had a lot of opportunity, particularly in terms of engaging with minority communities. If we were there in person in Atlanta, I think there's more that could have been done with that we missed in terms of a virtual event. And I think that's just the nature of the event. We already know that when we get to ISC, normally in Germany, in June, in Frankfurt, that's going to be a virtual event again. It's just too long a lead time in terms of event space and sponsorship. And I think we have to consider that for 2021 events. It's not just, well, the month before do we feel ready. There are long lead times in terms of space and contracts and sponsors, that this really needs to get solved 6 months in advance at least if you're going to commit to having an event. So my fingers are crossed that we can be back in person in St. Louis again. I think it's a huge benefit to us as a community if we can do that, both nationally and internationally. and in terms of just the chance conversations, and it's a relationship business, being able to see each other again. So I'm hoping we can be back together again in St. Louis a year from now. If we can't, I think they did about the best job they could with a virtual event, but gosh, I'd like to be back together in person again soon.
Yeah, I think we all feel that way. Absolutely. Lod, how about you? How would you assess your virtual SC20 experience?
Yeah, well, I compare with Eddystone point of view about virtual events, especially when I'm in a way different time zone than both Bob and Eddystone. I think that the SC20 was surprisingly good, better than I had anticipated. We are all now 8 months into the pandemic, and we are getting used to all those virtual meetings and virtual conferences. But this supercompute conference felt for me differently. The content was varied with high quality. There was a funny tweet by, I wrote it down, Todd Gamblin, achievement unlock alternating between two live streams in separate windows. So here you go about that. But I do believe that splitting the conference into 2 weeks, where the first week is the tutorials and the other one is the exhibitions, the paper, the invite talks, that should be definitely a keeper. It allowed me to participate in multiple tutorial, birds of feather talks and more. You know, what Bob had said in the previous answer, that only 288 people participated live in Beyond Stevens' keynote, and 8,000 watching the recording session. I believe that it's a good thing, because many times during the supercompute you have two talks scheduled on the same time, and you need to choose one. And I do want that this one will be a keeper. Absolutely, and what Eddystone talked about, that we are all missing the interaction. Eddystone talked about the minority and diversity of participants, but I'm saying also meeting the exhibitor and just walking on the floor. This is something which is missed. A lot of participants, and this is something that, you know, I'm not sure that might happen, but I suspect that a lot of participants went on with their daily routine while watching the conferences and were distracted. And this is one of the many side effects of the Zoom meeting. And as Eddystone said, I choose to be focused on a different presentation or talk. You know, and for future supercompute conferences, I do hope that we can find a format that combines both virtual attendance and lecture recording along with face-to-face discussion. I think that this is the winning combination.
Kind of a hybrid approach. Yeah, great stuff. Thanks a lot. Bob, in terms of announcements or vendor activity, maybe even some of the virtual Zoom parties, what stood out for you last week?
Well, I didn't go to any of the Zoom parties. I have to admit that. I apologize for that. You know, in terms of some of the vendor stuff, again, you know, I'm not going to directly answer the question. What I was looking for in my mind was, you know, if there's one phrase that I think encompasses what we're seeing in advanced computing right nowadays, it's the concept of hybrid. You know, you have a hybrid processor of CPUs and GPUs. You have a hybrid workspace where some of it's on the cloud and some of it's on-prem. You have hybrid architectures where, not yet, but the idea of using classical and quantum computers at the same time to reach certain jobs. Data centers are looking at computing in on-prem and also looking at the edge. And we're looking at a lot of interesting hybrid kind of applications and such. So to me, that's where the sector's going. It's this hybridization, if you will, of technologies at almost every level. But the one thing I really didn't see, and I'd like to see more of, is what's really driving a lot of the revenue and some of the interest in the sector right now is the migration of HPC workloads to the cloud. And I would like to see more reports and analysis and technology summaries of what's going on from a cloud perspective in terms of HPC. And so that's why I'll answer your question here finally, is the announcement about Microsoft Azure and their support for COVID, where they basically were able to implement a rather large MPI job across a number of cores on their Azure cloud. I thought, this is interesting. This is a new way to address a problem and really kind of put the stamp of approval on doing HPC in the cloud from a technology perspective. No one was arguing about cost or data security or what it costs to move memory storage around. It was, here's an interesting application in a cloud environment. And again, I'd like to see more activities coming out of what's going on in HPC in the cloud, as opposed to a continued emphasis on purely on-prem kinds of developments.
Okay, great. You know, Bob, you're not really answering my questions, but I like your answers. I'm kidding. Addison, how about you? News announcements, vendor activities, what stood out for you?
First of all, I'll agree with Bob. I didn't do too many of the parties. I was on a lot of the content. As I said, I'm still consuming a lot of the content and announcements from the show. There's a lot for me as an analyst to catch up on. Bob already hit on cloud, and I'll concur there. That's an area where there's just a lot of momentum and a lot happening. We talked about that in our pre-SC20 HPC market update in terms of the different ways that cloud and cloud-like services are contributing to the high-performance computing market. And rather than rehash that here, I'll point people to the recording and slides that are available on the presentation tab on our website at intersect360.com. In terms of the traditional announcements, I did find that I thought the most important announcements were competing announcements from NVIDIA and AMD, both of which had announcements on the GPU side. Of course, I'll start with AMD with getting their version of their new accelerator out, the MI100 GPU. And I think in contrast to NVIDIA, whose messaging has been really machine learning and AI heavy, AMD stayed true to their core corporate messaging of scientific computing and highlighted their 64-bit performance as the marquee statistic that they were really highlighting. NVIDIA, of course, had their own 80 gigabyte higher memory bandwidth parts. I think out of the flurry of announcements that came from NVIDIA, the one that's most important to core HPC business was NDR 400 gigabit InfiniBand. And we're certainly going to be tracking that as analysts in terms of how it migrates through the HPC market. There's tons to go digest. One thing I'm worried that people didn't take enough advantage of was the virtual booths that all the vendors had put up. And I did make an attempt, as I would in a regular supercomputing event, to visit as many as I could. I went to dozens of the booths and looked at the booth presentations, the welcome videos, what information is up and available. And it wasn't just the vendors. There was the normal assortment of national labs and agencies and university research booths. There's so much information that's still out there and available. I think I'm going to be consuming a lot of these announcements for some time to come.
Yes, indeed. Elad, how about you? News announcements, vendor activities that particularly caught your eye?
Well, Doug, that's a great question asking a vendor. And as a vendor, I'm going to steer, especially a vendor in stealth, I'm going to steer my answer towards this. Supercomputing was a fantastic one. I think that the quality of all the invite talks, the paper, the birds of feathers were fantastic, high quality. Most of them were looking forward towards the future. And I believe that we should all stay tuned.
Okay, very good. So I want to thank all three of you for your thoughtful comments this morning on last week's conference. Also to thank our sponsor, AMD, and their Instinct GPU group for sponsoring this panel. Thanks so much for your time.
Doug.